This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered.
Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 195 of the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. Today I wanted to share a past Q&A that I've done for the Language Therapy Advanced Foundations members group. I get a lot of questions about evaluations, so in this Q&A, I talk through ways to navigate evaluations, including considering a test's psychometric properties, how detailed it gets, and how to supplement with non-standardized protocols. It's really important to make that distinction between standardized and non-standardized. I think a lot of times we use words like informal, and the problem with using that word is that sometimes people assume that it means less rigorous, which is not true. There are a lot of things that are non-standardized but still rigorous. So keep that in mind as you listen to this Q&A. So that's what I talk about in the first half. In the second half, I talked about SLP career transitions and things to think about if you want to explore other ways to use your SLP credentials or are considering getting a doctorate or additional certifications. I also link to a couple other podcast episodes, including the episode 108, How to Do Multilingual Evaluations as a Monolingual Therapist with Meg Morgan. And even though I didn't mention them in this Q&A, I will also link to the other episodes that I've done about evaluations, including my conversation with Destiny Johnson about dynamic assessment and my conversation with Pooja Goyal and Prabhu Eswaran on supporting multilingual learners. The second part of this Q&A is also about how to do micro experiments that help you build skills and explore other ways to use your skills and build a portfolio of experience you can use to transition to the next stage of your career. I actually started a new position working as a child welfare administrator, which is not something that I originally thought that I would do in my career, but through an interesting turn of events, I ended up in a management position in one of the state agencies. And I think that people who are in clinical roles, not just SLPs, can really be flexible with how they think about their skills, but also really just consider their upward mobility when they're considering their clinical roles and just their options. So I also linked to one of my previous conversations. I believe it was episode 80, Career Test Runs and Calming Your Inner Critic with Stephanie Hayes. So that was a conversation that I had with one of my mentors when I was figuring out what I wanted to do with my work at Dr. Karen LLC, my business, as well as what I wanted to do in an official employed situation. So I hope you enjoy this Q&A. If you are interested in learning more about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, which is where I did this Q&A, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. This is my program that is designed for SLPs who want to build a framework for language therapy. And in the program, I teach people how to use vocabulary as a foundation and incorporate elements such as phonology, morphology, orthography, semantics, and syntax to build a robust system that really supports the skills that students need in order to support language comprehension. Again, to learn more about the program, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy.
Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone's doing well. Happy June. We're going to get started with the live Q&A from today. So I have two different topics I wanted to cover today. Some of them, I just wanted to briefly go through some of the posts and questions that have come up in the group this past month. And some of them I'm just going to redirect to old videos because I don't want to rehash what I've done on previous Q&As. So the main things that we had this month that came up were some additional questions on testing and psychometric properties. That's always something that comes up. And I have talked about this a lot lately. I am going to, in the chat below, link to a couple podcast episodes and some Facebook Lives that I've done just on the idea of portfolio assessments. I did a recent one with a therapist who is bilingual. And so it's about how to do a multilingual evaluation. But I think that this can be applicable to students who just speak one language. It use the same framework and idea when you're thinking about evaluations. So I will share those below. So we're going to talk about evaluations. There was a question about preschool screenings. For that one, I wanted to just touch base and just check in with the person who asked about that to make sure that she got her questions answered, because what I did was direct her to an older video that I did on some options for preschool screenings. But some of the things that I'm going to say about evaluations, you want to apply that same framework to screenings and think about it the same way as far as your process. Is just that for screenings, obviously, it's much more abbreviated. Then there was a question about just career path, EDD. Should I get my EDD? What else can I do with my SLP credentials and my skills, and what other things should I look into? This is a topic that I've always been really passionate about. I have done, actually, I will share another podcast episode about that because I am doing a lot of career exploration right now as well. And in a couple months, we'll probably share a little bit more about that once I know a couple things a little bit more certain. But I can share my experience with the doctorate, some things that you want to think about if you are considering getting a doctorate, or if you're thinking about what else can I do with my SLP credentials, what other things are out there, and what are some challenges and just things that I want to consider. So let's talk about tests. So there was a question about tests on the owls, or some subtests on the owls. So this person was asking about, what happens when you see a lot of differences in subtests on something like the owls, especially when you have something like that where the standard score is just a listening comprehension and oral expression. And how do we interpret that? And then also, how do we get good information on evaluations when we have all of these assessment procedures that have limitations to them and there's no one perfect test? So I'm going to talk about how we want to think about the formal evaluations. Obviously, if you've listened to any of my Q&As before, my recommendation is always that you think about a portfolio approach, which is that you're pulling from multiple sources. Now, when you pull from multiple sources, each source on its own isn't very strong, but when you start to pair them all together, that's when your case gets stronger because you have the benefits of each one of those tools and procedures that you used. So that kind of outweighs some of the downsides of any of the protocols that you're using. And so when we're thinking about portfolio, obviously formal norm referenced is one piece of that portfolio. But then you're also going to be wanting to pair it with things like work samples, language samples, and non-standardized procedures. So I think that it's really important that we distinguish between all the different types of assessment. We've got the qualitative, which again, formal assessment is quantitative. Formal assessments are typically quantitative. Some of them do have qualitative components where you're coding responses, but you get a score. So there's typically a number that you get. So there is a quantitative aspect. And then when we have qualitative, this is where you're looking at things like, writing samples where you're kind of coding responses, and you might be able to cluster different patterns, but it's not really about this standardized number. And then, qualitative could also include things like interviews, conversations, observations, those types of things. And then I wanted to differentiate the word non-standardized, because non-standardized, sometimes people say like, well, it's qualitative or qualitative. It's qualitative or quantitative. But actually, you can have something that is quantitative but not standardized. So it's really important that we differentiate those things, because I think a lot of times people feel like, well, if it's not a formal assessment, then it's not quantitative and I don't have any numbers to back up my claims. Well, that's not true. You can come up with a quantitative protocol that's not standardized, meaning that it hasn't been measured at a norm. There hasn't been normative sampling procedures. So there are protocols that you can come up with where you are, like taking data on things. Like in your therapy, you're taking quantitative data about how students are responding to things. So when we're thinking about an additional thing that we can do for our reports to back up some of our assessments, we can also use additional quantitative measures that are not standardized. So there's standardized, non-standardized, which can be both qualitative and quantitative, because qualitative, there are some qualitative components in standardized assessments, and there are quantitative components, but then non-standardized assessments can be both qualitative and quantitative as well. And I don't like to use the word informal, because that sounds a little loosey-goosey and it actually makes your protocol sound less legit than it actually is, whereas you can come up with something that is a process that you use over and over in therapy, and it can be pretty strong and consistent and solid, even if it's not something that's standardized. So you want to always be thinking about all those different options when you are doing your assessments. Now, when it comes to the formal assessment, we did have a good discussion. It was the original post was on May 24th about the owls by Nicole, and she posted that again about the owls and just wanting to know how to interpret some scores. And so the general discussion was that the owls doesn't break it down into the individual areas, and then something like the self breaks it down pretty well and gives you a lot of information, but doesn't have the psychometric properties aren't as strong, and it does tend to miss kids. I like the TILs as well. I know that that's something that I talk about a lot in here as well. So I would say, as far as like being a good test for psychometric properties and details, that's probably one of your best options. The drawback with the TILs is that it is more time consuming, and one of the other complaints that I have heard from people, which isn't really the test's fault, it's more of the system, the kind of a system issue, is that a lot of times it can be a little bit tricky to know what to do with the results of the TILs if you're not really sure how to navigate the service delivery in your building, because what happens is that there might be things that come out on that test that are very hard for you to address as an SLP who's got 30 minutes a week. So, for example, there might be some things that might be in your building, things that the reading specialist might be responsible for, or maybe a special ed teacher. So it might not be something that you address directly. And so I know that some people find that a little bit confusing. I don't think it's a deal breaker. I think you just have to understand, if I do this assessment, you want to make sure that you've got this team approach to the evaluation. Just like how a psychologist might be doing an evaluation and then a special ed teacher is doing the services, we want to think about all that information that's coming through with the evaluation, like the psychologist assessment, the social worker, whoever else is doing assessments, and kind of pulling it together. And yes, typically if you're the SLP, most of your goals are going to be written, and the majority of the information from your eval is going to be used to inform your goals. But there can be a little wiggle room and flexibility there, where you and the special ed teacher, for example, could be looking at the psychologist's information and your information and kind of pulling it together, and then figuring out who's going to work on what. So that's something to think about with the TILs, that if you are in a school, sometimes it's kind of like, well, what do I do with this? I can't even address this with the way that the model works at my building. Well, that's not necessarily an issue with the test. It's just that you do have to understand how you can kind of work that into your goals, but then also figure out, okay, this information might be something that we could put on the IEP somewhere, but maybe I am co-implementing, or maybe this is some information we could kind of use over here for the special ed teacher's evaluation or something like that. And then again, the other issue is, what if you are, what if it's speech only and then you're responsible for everything? Well, and then you have to get even more creative where you might have some goals that are a little bit more things that you could kind of try to work on, but at the same time, you might have something that you might be, training the teacher to do, or like trying to work those things in other ways, because you know that they can't necessarily be addressed in your speech and language sessions. So anyways, kind of went off on a tangent with the TILs, but the main thing is that that is one of the good options. Another thing, a couple tests that you might consider that break things down a little bit more than the OWLs, things like the word test, the language processing test. They do give you more specific semantic information. The listening comprehension test is decent. There is the test of word finding as well, which kind of dive more into semantics. So those are some good options as far as diving into the semantic skills and students' ability to define and describe words. There's some of that on the self as well. And again, you kind of have to, and I'm not saying make a diagnostic decision based on a subtest score, but I am saying kind of look at the patterns of behavior in the responses and not just the test, just to give you a little bit more information about goals and interpretation. And then there are also things like the TOLD, which also give you some information about ability to define. I know that there are some good ones on the TOLD-I, where kids have to do some kind of interesting semantic manipulation and associations that could give you some information about vocabulary and processing. And then there's also some assessments, some subtests on the TOLD where you're doing sentence repetition. And so that gives you a little bit of insight on syntax so that you can get an idea of how students are able to, are they able to repeat back a sentence and put it in, say it back the same way that you said it to them. Because then that is something that does give you an insight into what sentence structures they know. And all those things that I just mentioned, all those tasks that are on the subtests of those formal assessments can also be things that you do. You can come up with your own probes and sentences and use them as non-standardized assessments as well. Okay, so I wanted to just check in there. Anybody who was participating in that thread, let me know if you have any questions. Again, the question about standardized assessments for early childhood, I did have a handful of threads about that, and I posted them in that comment thread. So if you have questions about early childhood, let me know. I'm happy to go into further detail, but do check out that post because I linked to another video that I did a while back. Okay. So let's switch gears and talk about career switching. So the question is, going back and forth, like let's say you've been in SLP for a while, you're working in a, school, or you've tried a bunch of different settings and you're feeling like, this is like, and this is kind of how I felt in the school where I was like, this is great. But I always kind of knew that I might want to transition at some point to something else that was related, but to education and speech pathology in some way, but not exactly, a role where I am an SLP in a school responsible for direct services. I knew for my career transition, like when I started in the schools, I started my doctorate in special ed. Initially, I wanted to just go back, and there were a couple courses that I didn't take when I was in my communication sciences and disorders master's degree. And so I just went back and took them, just like above and beyond my degree, just because I wanted to have that information. Like I didn't take the 0 to 3 class. It was kind of a scheduling issue and they let me graduate anyway. So even though I already had my degree, I was like, I should probably go back and take that. So I did that, and then I did some things in assistive technology and was looking at some additional certificates in special ed that were a graduate certificate where you can take a couple classes and get it, not a full-blown degree. But when I was doing that, that's when people were kind of like, hey, you already have a master's degree, you should really consider a doctorate. And that's when I decided to go back to get my EDD in special ed. I initially, honestly did not get a lot of career counseling. I wish I would have gotten more. I decided to go into the field of education. I'll just use that kind of broadly, because a lot of the women in my family were teachers, and that's just what I knew. And it was like, well, this is a job that you're supposed to do, and that's just kind of the direction I went. And it, I was interested in it. It's not like I was forced into something that I absolutely did not want to do, but I didn't really feel like I got a lot of exposure to different options. And when I was going through my my master's program, it was kind of like here's just these couple options that you can do as an SLP. Like you can be medical, you can be private practice, which really there wasn't a lot of information about that either. So it was like medical, outpatient, or school. And then I guess, EI, but all of them were therapy roles. It was like you have a bunch of different settings that you can do for direct therapy. And then maybe eventually you can transition to being a supervisor, or you can go back and get your doctorate and teach at the college level. So those were the options that were presented to me around, just because you want to learn different skills, you want to, move up and try something else, move into a leadership position. And there's just not as much of that when you're just thinking about the SLP role. And we certainly don't really get a lot of coaching and mentorship around this. And so it can be kind of difficult if you are, you've been doing your therapy role for a while and you're kind of thinking like, is there anything else I can do with this? So what I wanted to share with you is that that's actually pretty normal. And I think that it's not made normal in our field because it's not what people do. But this is what a lot of people do in their careers in general is, like, I've been doing this for a while and I want a new challenge. Like it's a normal thing to feel. So I wanted to just validate that it's not weird. It doesn't necessarily mean that you made the wrong choice in being an SLP just because you're kind of feeling like what else is out there. Like I feel like that all the time after a couple of years, like, with different projects with my business where it's like, I've been working on this for a while and now I want to try something new and do something over here. Like, it's part of the reason why I started a podcast a few years ago. Cause it was like, I'm doing courses and all of that's great, but like, I want to try something else now and learn some new skills. So, so when it comes to thinking about your EDD, some of the things that I did not know about that I wish I would have known about is just what potential career options are out there, and just some things that you're going to need to do when you consider, or like what to expect after getting an EDD or a doctorate. I can't really speak to a clinical doctorate as much, but I would say just in general is that whenever you go back for an advanced degree, it is putting you in contention for roles that are more competitive and more challenging. And so like for my EDD, I could go back and be a professor. So if you like the idea of doing research and working at a university, that is something that that would be an appealing option to you. The other thing is that I got my director of special ed credentials, so I can also be a school administrator. So because I went special ed, that's something that is an additional thing that, yes, it kind of falls within the realm of being a clinic supervisor or something like that. But that's another option that I added to my potential, to my plate that I didn't necessarily have before, that I wasn't initially thinking about when I first started to be an SLP. Because now I could do something where I could do something at the state, like a government job, doing something school administration, or I can work for a school district being a special ed coordinator or a special ed director. Honestly, you can possibly get a lot of these coordinator roles without having an additional degree. Sometimes it helps, but there were many times when I was interviewing for these positions where they would give it to somebody with a master's degree in special ed or speech pathology or something, because a lot of times in a district, at least the way it works in Illinois, is that they need to have a special ed director that has that credential, but they can have coordinators underneath them that are reporting to them, that are not responsible for staff evaluations, that have leadership responsibilities. And as long as they're reporting to someone who does that credential, they don't necessarily have to have their director of special ed. So that's something to consider as well, is that you might be able to look for some of those opportunities now without having a degree, if that is something that you're interested in. So that is one thing to consider there. Now, with the job search, something that you want to think about is it definitely expands your options. It's going to teach you a lot of skills. I loved a lot of the skills that I learned when I was getting my doctorate, but the positions are significantly more competitive. And so you can't expect your degree to just automatically open doors for you without you having to do the work of networking and knowing how to sell yourself and knowing how to navigate the job search process. It is definitely a very specific skill set. I am learning a lot about it right now. But I found it very challenging. Like the job search for SLP roles is different in every state, but it's still pretty good in Illinois. So it wouldn't be hard for me if I wanted to go be an SLP, like doing teletherapy or go into a school district or something like that. There's a lot of jobs still in my state for those types of things. But if I wanted to do something else, there's a lot fewer of those roles and a lot more qualified candidates competing for them. So you do have to understand how to network, and you don't necessarily have to know how to do that right now while you're going through your program. You don't have to know how to do all of that, but you do have to be aware that as you're getting closer and closer to graduation and figuring out what am I going to do with this, you want to make sure that you've got some connections and that you're kind of revisiting this, like what direction am I going with this degree? What connections do I have? What research am I doing about possible roles that I can do with this type of job? Because it's not like it is, for a lot of the roles, the job market is really competitive. And they, even if you have a doctorate, it's definitely not a shoo-in. So that's something to consider, is that, it can kind of open the door, but you've got to really do a lot of legwork to do those other things. So I always tell that to people, because that's something that nobody really told me. And I actually got some pretty not super helpful advice about the job search process. I kind of got a lot of like, oh, you're so amazing, you can just go and, you'll be great at anything. And it was great and encouraging, but it didn't really set me up for success, because I wasn't really thinking about the challenges that were lying ahead of me, as far as like just understanding how to do research about a job and interview and all of those things. I will say one of the things that you want to think about if you are looking at like what potential roles would I want to go through when I do an EDD or a doctorate. If you are thinking about a doctorate and you're thinking about working at a university, relocation is a real possibility. So think about if you're really willing to relocate. A lot of the university jobs in a tenure track position, there are some flexibility, some more flexible options. I have done some adjunct work for a university that's not in my state, and I did it all remote. But adjunct work does not pay very well, and when you actually are hired on as tenure track, that can open a lot of doors. So you can come in as an assistant professor, but then there's some other income generation opportunities that might come up for you when you're part of the university that are on top of your base salary. That's something that one of my mentors shared with me. And then if you are an assistant professor at a university, you're working for this big, organization. There might be some other leadership roles that you could move into if you're working at that university, that are not necessarily just assistant professor and research roles. Like I have somebody who was on my dissertation committee, the one who shared the thing about, there's other opportunities for income. She did some kind of administration role after a while. So she was doing research and teaching and got tenured. And then she moved into some other leadership role at the university for like a tutoring initiative. So she is in more of kind of a coordinator role. And that's just because she worked for the university. There was just a lot more options than with the school district. So yeah, I don't, as far as the salary for the like assistant professors, the base isn't, it tends to not be as much as with school administrators, and depending on where you are. With this, there are some things that you consider. You can consider doing that at like at a school district. So special ed director, special ed coordinator. A lot of times the coordinator roles, I looked into that, and I was working at one school district that was in a co-op. And so I worked for the district, but the coordinators that we used that worked with us, that reported to the director, which would be kind of where I would have been more of a realistic starting point than to try to go for a director role. So that probably would have been where I made that transition. The salary for starting as a coordinator in my co-op was actually less than what I was making as a school SLP. So I didn't do a lot of work pursuing that option just because there weren't any openings at that time. But that was something that I kind of came up against, which I probably would have done that. It wasn't a huge difference. I probably would have done it for the experience and the opportunity, but that was something to consider as well. And it really just kind of depends on your district and your co-op and how that works. But the other thing to consider, again, is that if you do want to move up to a director role or something like that, then those are a lot more competitive and you have to do a lot of work with networking. There are other organizations that you can think about. There's U.S. Department of Education. There's your State Board of Education. There are nonprofits that you can think about. There are, like your state might have some different roles. Things like learning and development, where you're doing like training and HR for employees. If you like teaching and mentoring people. There are, I know at my state board, there are these roles called principal consultants, where you're mentoring school administrators with some of their different programs. A lot of times a master's degree in education is all you need from that. And so probably SLP credentials, you could probably make a case for something like that as well. That's how it is in my state. You want to see what's there for you as well. So those are some things that when you're going the EDD route that you can look into. Again, a lot of those things you might be able to get into some of those roles without. So it could be useful to you if you're thinking about going that way, to just do some career exploration right now. See if you might be able to, get some experience and use the EDD. Like, don't think of that as like, I'm going to get this degree and it's going to just like be a magic bullet. Think of it as like, this is going to be this learning experience for me and it's going to be great. And I'm going to build up all of these skills. And yes, for certain positions, they do require a doctorate. So that is, going to be a factor for those positions. But I wouldn't look at it as like, when I get this, it's going to be this magic thing, because, it is still going to be a process. So, and I don't say that to, be a Debbie Downer. I say that because I do think all of this, at least for me, it has been totally worth it. But there are a lot of things that I wish I would have known going into it, that I wish someone would have told me. And I also think that whatever you decide to do, if you are going to think about additional certifications, education, you also want to think about, like, while you're in this experience, yes, you might get this additional thing that you can put, like an additional piece of paper that you can put on something. But you also want to think about, how am I going to use this experience to create a narrative, to create like a portfolio of experience that I can use and just like have this story that I tell about myself when I'm networking, when I'm explaining what I do, when I explain how I could fit into a certain role, because all of that networking and interviewing is all about knowing how to tell a story about what you do. And this is, continues to be a process and a journey for me as well. Because really, whether it's a degree, whether it's a job that you get that gives you work experience, whether you go the self-employed route and do, kind of freelance work, which for a lot of the roles that I look at and that I'm currently looking at, I'm using my degrees, I'm using my my experience as a self-employed person as part of that portfolio. That's something that I did to get a lot of this experience that I'm leveraging right now, as opposed to getting a job. But all of these things, you want to kind of think about it as, I'm going to go and like talk to people, do some research, see if I can maybe do some side projects in my current position, maybe on the side of my current job, and it could be kind of a side hustle kind of thing. But you want to think about those things as potential things that might make you money, like taking on private clients, working somewhere else on the side, doing something like I've done. You want to think about those as, yeah, they could potentially make you money, but they also are things that you can build to your portfolio of experience. And they're also things that you can do as little mini experiments to figure out, what are some other things that I could do with my credentials. Another thing to think about is that the ed tech space is booming right now. I have talked to a lot of SLPs, former teachers who are working for ed tech companies. Some of those, depending on the company, I've heard various things about work culture and also just job security, because with a tech company, sometimes if something gets cut, then people get laid off and things like that. So you definitely want to do your research on the company. But that's another option as well, is thinking about working for a tech company that does educational products. I've talked to a handful of people who were formerly SLPs or formerly teachers that are in the ed tech space and are really enjoying it, doing things like writing curriculum, making materials, designing products, even people who have moved into sales and marketing roles, which I know sometimes sales and marketing can sound really intimidating and scary, but I do a lot with marketing for my business. And I think that there are a lot of those companies where having somebody with an educational background in one of those roles could be really beneficial. So yeah, those are a lot of different options that you can think of. The job market is competitive, but there's a lot of opportunities right now, and there are a lot of ways that you can use your skills as an SLP besides being in a direct clinical role. And the great thing about it is that you don't have to necessarily pick one thing. You can have kind of a hybrid situation where maybe you are seeing clients directly because you like that aspect of your job, but you're just adding another layer to what you're already doing. You don't necessarily have to think about it like, I'm done with this and I'm moving on to this. You can kind of think about it as stacking in layers. That's another option to think about as well. Or that could be something you use to transition from one thing to another, or it could be something where it's like, I like to do a lot of different things and I'm going to create this like customized career situation for myself. So I'm going to wrap up on that now. I hope that gives you some things to think about. I can go on about this topic for a long time, but yeah, I think that when it comes to deciding if you want a degree, don't do it because you think it's going to be a magic fix. Do it because you have, a passion to learn something and you have a specific career direction that you want to go, and it aligns with that. And also you want to think about it as, yes, this might be something that officially makes me qualified for certain roles, but you also want to think about it as an opportunity to develop those additional experiences that you're going to use to tell a story about what you do, because that's really like if you can't do that, once you move beyond your degree, it's going to be hard to get whatever, to actually be able to use that degree or experience or whatever it is. So yeah, let me know if you have any other questions about that. One more thing I will say about doctoral programs is that don't assume that you have to pay for all of them yourself or pay for it 100% yourself. I got funding for a lot of the expenses in my doctoral program. I worked at a district that sometimes if there were people that did student teaching at the university, because I was working at a district that was close to the university where I went, they would give these vouchers, like these tuition waivers. A lot of times, if you have a student teacher, the university gives you a tuition waiver. And people had student teachers in my district all the time. Not all of them wanted to be taking college courses. So there was this pool of tuition waivers sitting there, and I could go, since I was going back to school, I could say, hey, are there any extra tuition waivers? And a lot of times I could get them that way. They also would reimburse a certain amount every year as long as my courses were related to what I was doing in my job, which I was going back for special ed. So obviously that was very relevant to me being on a special ed team as an SLP. So they reimbursed some of that. There were some other additional scholarships and funding sources, some directly at the university. There were tuition waivers I could apply for. There were just other little independent organizations that I did for grad school a couple times. It was $500 here, $1,000 there, those kinds of things. And then also I was adjunct for the university. And the semesters that I was adjunct, I got a tuition waiver as well. So sometimes they will give you a tuition waiver if you work for them and you teach a course. And so that was kind of killing multiple birds with one stone when I did that, because I got a tuition waiver. I got experience teaching a college course. And for one semester, that actually fulfilled a credit that I had to take, because for a doctoral program, you have to teach a course. It's kind of like student teaching at the doctoral level. So there were multiple things that I did there as well. So again, you might not necessarily be able to have it fully funded, but I would look into, when you're thinking about options, look into funding, because funding is huge. That's going to make a big difference on not having a lot of student loans is going to make a big impact on how you feel about that degree afterwards. So that's definitely something that I recommend people look into, because I think that a lot of times if you've taken out student loans in the past, just because it was, what you had to do at the time, we kind of get in the habit of just taking out more and more loans. But I would encourage you to do research to see if you can get some of that funded, because there are options, and there are ways that you can take some of that financial burden off of yourself if this is something that you're really passionate about doing. So yeah, that wraps up, I think, all the questions for today.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all of the links where you can go to learn about all of the great resources that we mentioned in this episode, as well as where you can go to learn more about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program that helps SLPs and other professionals working on language to create a system for language therapy. You can learn more about the program at drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. As always, thank you so much for listening. It helps me so much if you leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you found this useful, please feel free to share it with your friends or colleagues. If you are interested in being a guest, if you would like to invite me to be a guest on your show, or if you have a suggestion for a guest, please send me an email at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.